Hey there. Tonight, we find ourselves aboard a pirate ship in the 17th century. We are trapped in rotting wood. We are drinking algae-filled water. We are bleeding from scurvy. We are realizing that the only real treasure out here is a clean death. Drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always love seeing this little time-traveling community gathering here from all over the world. Now, dim the lights. Tuck yourself in. Let's drift far, far away. Let's be clear. No one in the 17th century woke up and said, "You know what? I'd like to steal cargo from merchant ships for 3 stale biscuits, and the honor of sleeping in a hammock crawling with lice." Becoming a pirate wasn't a career path. It was more like a last stop on the life went horribly wrong train. Most 17th century pirates weren't swashbuckling adventurers with treasure maps and parrots. They were desperate sailors. They were discharged naval officers. They were runaway indentured servants. They were people so far off society's radar, they could disappear at sea and still not be missed in the parish records. If you were well off, you didn't become a pirate. You invested in privateering ventures. If you had a title, land, or even a chicken to your name, you were in management. But if you just escaped debtor's prison, had a reputation for handling rope work, and could climb rigging without falling to your death, congratulations. Someone somewhere was about to slide a bottle of rum across the tavern table and whisper about a merchant vessel loaded with silver. And that vessel wasn't an easy target. You weren't asked to raid Bob the fisherman's dinghy. It was usually a heavily armed Spanish galleon. It was a Dutch East India Company ship with 30 cannons. It was a naval escort with enough firepower to turn your rickety sloop into driftwood. The promise of treasure was tempting. The job was horrifying. But by the time someone considered it, they had nothing left to lose. No family, no future, and definitely no health insurance. Plus, let's not forget the absolute lack of job perks. No pension, no glory, no shore leave that didn't involve hiding from bounty hunters. You couldn't exactly hang up a shingle that said maritime acquisitions by appointment. You just had to stay quiet, move fast, and never, ever tell anyone what you did for a living. Especially not loudly over rum at the port tavern. "Oh yeah, I'm a traveling fish merchant. The blood? Red fish." So yes, nobody dreamed of being a 17th century pirate. They landed there because the world chewed them up and spat them out wearing a cutlass and desperately hoping the next ship they boarded had something worth dying for. You weren't the hero. You weren't even the villain. You were the footnote that made merchants hire more guards and probably didn't live to spend your share of the plunder. Let's burst the first myth wide open. Pirate ships weren't romantic vessels with billowing sails and crews singing sea shanties while polishing their cutlasses. Your ship was a floating death trap. It was held together by tar, prayer, and the collective delusion that it wouldn't sink before you found your next meal. First, the smell. Imagine wet wood, human waste, rotting food, bilge water, gunpowder, and unwashed bodies that hadn't seen soap in months. All stewing together in a wooden box under the Caribbean sun. That's your home now. The stench was so thick you could practically chew it, and you couldn't escape it, because there was nowhere to go. The ocean doesn't have fresh air breaks. Your sleeping quarters. Forget about it. You got a hammock if you were lucky. A pile of sailcloth if you weren't. Space was measured in inches, not feet. When you slept, you could smell the breath of the guy above you. You could hear the digestive processes of the man below. You could feel the rats investigating your hair for food scraps. Privacy was a concept that died the moment you stepped aboard. The ship leaked. Constantly. Water seeped through the hull. It pooled in the bilge. It created a permanent slick of slime that made every surface treacherous. You'd wake up damp, work damp, eat damp, and go to sleep damp again. Mold grew on everything. Your clothes, your bedding, your skin. Your boots rotted off your feet. Your leather belt turned into something resembling soggy bread. And the rats. Oh, the rats. They weren't cute ship mascots. They were fat, aggressive, disease-carrying monsters that competed with you for food and lost no sleep over biting chunks out of sleeping pirates. They gnawed through ropes. They contaminated water supplies. They left droppings in everything you tried to eat. Some crews hunted them for protein. Others just learned to sleep with their mouths closed. The ship moved constantly. Even in calm seas, it rolled, pitched, and creaked like a dying whale. Your stomach never quite adjusted. Seasickness wasn't just for landlubbers. Veteran sailors still puked over the rail during storms. And they turned your floating home into a timber and canvas earthquake that could snap masts. They could flood decks. They could send grown men flying across the deck like rag dolls. But the absolute worst part? The bathroom situation. Head was a plank with a hole cut in it. It was suspended over the ocean at the front of the ship. No walls, no privacy, no toilet paper, just you, your business, and 30 other pirates who might need to use the facilities while you were still occupying them. In rough seas, waves could splash up through the hull. In calm seas, you had an audience. There was no dignity at sea. Your floating prison measured maybe 100 feet from bow to stern. If you were on a decent-sized sloop, smaller vessels crammed 50 to 80 men into a space the size of a large house. You couldn't walk 10 steps in any direction without bumping into someone, without stepping on something, without hitting your head on a beam. Claustrophobia wasn't just a feeling, it was a way of life. And maintenance? The ship required constant work, pumping bilge water, patching holes, replacing rotted ropes, scraping barnacles, recaulking seams. Everyone worked all the time, because the alternative was drowning together in the middle of nowhere. You weren't just a pirate, you were an unpaid shipwright, a carpenter, and a janitor who occasionally got to raid merchant vessels between maintenance duties. Forget the hearty meals you see in movies. Pirate food wasn't sustenance. It was survival in its most desperate form. Your diet consisted of whatever wouldn't rot completely during months at sea. And even then, most of it was trying its best to poison you. Hardtack was your bread. And hardtack was misery in biscuit form. These rock-hard discs of flour and water were baked until they could survive nuclear war. To eat them, you had to soak them in whatever liquid you could find. Rum, water, or soup. You soaked them until they softened enough that you wouldn't break your teeth. But soaking revealed the weevils, tiny white grubs that had been living inside your bread the whole time. Most pirates just ate them. Protein was protein. Salt pork was your meat, and it bore no resemblance to the pork you knew on land. This stuff was cured in so much salt it could preserve itself indefinitely. It was grey, tough as leather, and salty enough to make your mouth pucker like you'd been sucking lemons. You had to soak it for hours just to make it chewable. Even then, it tasted like salted cardboard with a hint of pig. Water was your biggest enemy. Fresh water turned green with algae within days. It grew slimy. It developed a taste like swamp mud. Eventually it became so contaminated that drinking it meant choosing between dehydration and dysentery. Smart pirates mixed it with rum or wine to kill the bacteria, but that just meant you were slightly drunk and mildly poisoned instead of stone sober and definitely poisoned. Rum was your salvation and your curse. It didn't spoil, it helped sanitize water, and it made everything else tolerable. But it also made you stupid, slow, and prone to making decisions that got you killed. Pirates who drank too much fell overboard. They got into fights. They made tactical errors during raids. Pirates who didn't drink enough died of thirst or waterborne diseases. Fish was supposed to supplement your diet, but catching fish while sailing wasn't as easy as dropping a line over the side. Fish near shipping lanes were often contaminated by waste dumped from other vessels. Tropical fish could be poisonous. Raw fish carried parasites that made you wish you'd stuck with the weevils. And if you were being chased by naval ships, you couldn't exactly stop to fish. Vegetables? Laughable. Anything green rotted within days of leaving port. Some ships carried onions, which lasted longer, but they still turned to mush and attracted every fly within 100 miles. Citrus fruits helped prevent scurvy, but they were expensive. They spoiled quickly, and most pirate crews couldn't afford them. Scurvy wasn't just a disease, it was a guarantee. When supplies ran low, which happened frequently, you ate whatever you could catch, kill or scavenge. Seabirds were fair game, but they tasted like fish and had the texture of old boots. Sea turtles were a delicacy, if you could catch one, and if your captain felt generous enough to share. Sometimes you ate rats, sometimes you ate the ship's cat, sometimes you eyed your fellow pirates and wondered if they'd notice one less crew member. And let's talk about scurvy, because scurvy was coming for you whether you knew it or not. Your gums would start bleeding, your teeth would loosen and fall out, your skin would develop purple blotches, your joints would ache like you'd been beaten with hammers, old wounds would reopen, you'd feel tired all the time, but sleep wouldn't help. Eventually you'd start bleeding internally and die, all because you couldn't get a decent orange. Meals weren't social events. They were desperate attempts to get enough nutrition to survive another day. You ate standing up. You held your bowl with one hand while gripping something solid with the other. As the ship rolled, you ate fast before the sea spray could soak your food, or a wave could dump it overboard. You ate everything, even the parts that tasted suspicious, because wasting food meant starving later. The cook wasn't a chef. He was usually whoever had lost a limb and couldn't perform regular ship duties anymore. His job was to make inedible things slightly less inedible. He boiled everything into stews that could hide the fact that your meat was green, that your vegetables were mush, and that your water was growing things that hadn't been discovered by science yet. If the food didn't kill you, the diseases would line up to take their turn. A 17th century pirate ship was basically a floating petri dish, and you were the experiment. Dysentery hit first and hit hard. Bad water, contaminated food, and poor sanitation meant your digestive system was under constant attack. You'd spend hours hanging over the rail, losing everything you'd managed to eat while praying a wave wouldn't wash you overboard. Dehydration was inevitable, but drinking more bad water just made things worse. Some pirates died from dysentery alone, too weak to eat, too sick to work, too dehydrated to survive. Typhus came courtesy of the lice that lived in every piece of clothing, every hammock, every surface on the ship. These weren't ordinary lice. They carried bacteria that caused high fevers, severe headaches, and a rash that spread across your body like spilled wine. Typhus could kill half a crew in a matter of weeks. The only treatment was to burn the infected person's belongings and hope it didn't spread further. Yellow fever was your tropical nightmare. Mosquitoes breeding in standing water brought this disease aboard, and it was a killer. Your skin turned yellow, you vomited blood, and your organs shut down one by one. There was no cure, no treatment, no hope. If yellow fever hit your crew, you counted yourself lucky if only half of them died. Malaria was another mosquito-delivered death sentence. Chills, fevers, sweats, and delusions that could last for weeks. Some pirates survived their first bout with malaria, only to have it return again and again, each time weaker, each time closer to being their last. The lucky ones died quickly, the unlucky ones suffered for months. Gangrene was a constant threat. Any cut, scrape, or wound could become infected in the filthy conditions aboard ship. Without proper medical care, infected wounds turned black. They smelled like rotting meat, and they spread up your limbs like poison. The only treatment was amputation. It was performed by whoever had the steadiest hands and the sharpest saw. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, just a piece of leather to bite down on, and the hope that you'd pass out from pain before they finished cutting. Skin diseases thrived in the damp, dirty conditions. Fungal infections turned your skin into a map of red, itchy patches. Bacterial infections created boils and abscesses that oozed pus and attracted flies. Saltwater sores developed wherever clothing rubbed against wet skin. They created raw, painful wounds that never quite healed. Your skin wasn't your protective barrier. It was your body's most vulnerable point. Venereal diseases were souvenirs from port visits. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections spread through crews like wildfire. There were no cures, no treatments that actually worked, and no way to avoid them if you were unlucky enough to catch them. They caused pain, insanity, and eventually death, but slowly enough that you'd suffer for years first. Parasites were inevitable. Worms lived in contaminated water and undercooked food. They took up residence in your intestines. They stole your nutrition, and they multiplied until you looked like a skeleton with a distended belly. Some worms grew to impressive lengths. Pirates would compare tapeworms like fishermen comparing catches, except the worms were living inside them. Respiratory infections flourished in the damp air and close quarters. Colds became pneumonia. Coughs became tuberculosis. A simple sore throat could develop into an infection that closed your airway. You'd hear crew members coughing all night, spitting blood into buckets, struggling to breathe while trying to work sails and rigging. And there was no medical care worth mentioning. The ship's doctor was usually whoever claimed to have medical knowledge, which often meant someone who'd watched an amputation once or had successfully treated a rash with rum. Medical supplies consisted of whatever they could steal from captured ships or buy in port, usually rum for disinfection, some herbs that may or may not have had medicinal properties, and whatever sharp instruments could serve as surgical tools. Surgery was performed on deck, in full view of the crew, with no anesthesia except rum. Patients were held down while their limbs were sawed off, bullets were dug out with whatever tools were available, and wounds were cauterized with hot metal. Many patients died from the surgery itself. Others died from infections that developed afterward. The lucky ones just passed out from pain and woke up missing whatever body part had been causing the problem. Violence wasn't something that happened during raids. It was the baseline of daily life aboard a pirate ship. From the moment you woke up until you fell asleep, if you were lucky enough to survive that long, the threat of violence hung over everything like morning fog. Your own crew was more dangerous than your enemies. Cramped conditions, limited resources, constant stress, and too much rum created a powder keg of human emotions. Arguments escalated to knife fights over trivial things. Who got to eat first? Whose turn it was to work the bilge pump? Or who had been looking at someone's hammock the wrong way? Pirates settled disputes with cutlasses, pistols, and whatever else came to hand. The captain's authority wasn't based on respect or maritime law. It was based on fear and the ability to kill anyone who challenged it. Captains maintained control through public punishments that served as entertainment and education for the rest of the crew. Floggings were common for minor infractions. The cat-o'-nine-tails wasn't just a whip. It was 9 separate whips, each tipped with metal or glass. It was designed to tear flesh from bone with every stroke. Keel hauling was reserved for serious offences. They'd tie you to a rope, throw you overboard, and drag you under the ship from one side to the other. The barnacles covering the ship's hull would slice you to ribbons while you tried not to drown. If you survived, you'd be so cut up that salt water would feel like liquid fire for weeks. Many pirates didn't survive. That was rather the point. Marooning was a slower death sentence. Pirates who violated the ship's articles or crossed the captain might be abandoned on a desert island with nothing but a pistol and a single shot. The pistol wasn't for hunting or self-defense. It was for suicide when starvation and thirst became unbearable. Some islands had no fresh water, others had water, but no food. All of them had plenty of time to think about what you'd done wrong. During raids, violence exploded in concentrated bursts of chaos and blood. Pirates didn't fight with honor or follow rules of engagement. They fought like desperate men who knew that losing meant hanging from the nearest yardarm. Cutlass fights weren't elegant duels. They were brutal hacking matches where the goal was to disable your opponent as quickly as possible. A cutlass could take off a hand, split a skull, or gut someone like a fish. Pistols were single-shot weapons that took forever to reload, so pirates carried multiple guns and used them like clubs after firing. Hand-to-hand combat was common, vicious, and personal. Pirates bit, they gouged eyes, they threw sand, and they used every dirty trick they could think of. There were no referees, no timeouts, and no mercy for anyone who fell. Captured enemies faced brutal interrogation. Pirates needed information about cargo, defensive measures, and other ships in the area. Torture was standard procedure. They'd use rope to cut off circulation, heated metal to burn flesh, or simple beating until someone talked. The goal wasn't just information, it was terror. Word would spread that this crew didn't just rob you, they made you suffer first. Some pirates developed reputations for particular cruelties. They'd force captives to eat their own ears, cut off fingers one by one, or invent new forms of torment that would become legendary in tavern stories. These weren't psychopaths. They were men who'd learnt that fear was more effective than actual violence for getting merchant ships to surrender without a fight. But violence also turned inward. It ate the crew from within. Pirates who showed weakness were targeted by stronger crew members. Anyone who hesitated during a fight. Anyone who complained about conditions. Anyone who seemed likely to desert was viewed as a liability. Ships sometimes lost more crew members to internal violence than to external enemies. Alcohol amplified every violent tendency. Drunk pirates were unpredictable, dangerous, and often suicidal. They'd pick fights with men twice their size, challenge officers to duels, or decide that this was the perfect time to settle old grievances. Many pirates died not in glorious battles against naval forces, but in stupid brawls over card games or perceived slights that wouldn't have mattered in the morning. The threat of violence was constant psychological pressure. You had to appear strong enough that others wouldn't test you, but not so threatening that you'd be seen as a challenge to authority. You slept with weapons within reach. You watched your back during meals. You never turned your full attention to any task because relaxing your guard meant inviting attack. And when the violence finally touched you, when the cutlass sliced across your ribs, when the pistol ball shattered your shoulder, when the belaying pin cracked your skull, there was no hospital, no surgery, no recovery time. You bound your wounds with whatever cloth you could find, poured rum on the cuts to prevent infection, and went back to work, because showing weakness meant becoming a target, and becoming a target meant joining the growing collection of bones scattered across Caribbean beaches. The romantic image of pirates capturing merchant ships through cunning and courage is pure fiction. Every raid was a desperate gamble, where the odds of dying horribly was significantly higher than the chances of getting rich. First, finding a target wasn't like shopping for groceries. Ships traveled in convoys for protection. They varied their routes to avoid known pirate hunting grounds. They carried minimal cargo during certain seasons. Intelligence was usually wrong, outdated, or deliberately misleading. You might spend weeks searching for a particular ship only to discover it had sailed 2 months earlier, taken a different route, or never existed in the first place. When you did spot a potential target, you had to get close enough to attack without being identified as pirates. Merchant ships weren't stupid. They knew that any vessel approaching at speed meant trouble. They'd try to outrun you, signal for help, or reach the protection of a naval patrol. Your ship had to be faster, better sailed, and luckier than theirs. Most of the time, you weren't. Merchant vessels weren't defenseless. They carried cannons, armed crews, and passengers who would fight for their lives. Some merchant ships were actually disguised naval vessels, specifically hunting pirates. Others were heavily fortified East India Company ships with professional soldiers aboard. You never knew if you were attacking a helpless cargo hauler or a floating fortress until the shooting started. The approach itself was terrifying. Cannonballs weighing 12 to 32 pounds could punch through your ship's hull. They sent splinters flying like wooden shrapnel. One hit below the waterline meant your ship would sink. One hit to your mast meant you couldn't maneuver or escape. One hit to your powder magazine meant everyone died in a ball of fire that could be seen for miles. Boarding was where most pirates died. You had to swing across on ropes, climb up the side of an enemy ship, or jump from one vessel to another while both ships rolled in the waves and people shot at you. Many pirates missed their jump and fell between the ships. They were crushed as the hulls slammed together. Others made it aboard only to face defenders who had every advantage. They knew their ship's layout. They had prepared positions, and they were fighting for their lives. Once aboard, you were trapped. There was no retreat, no calling for reinforcements, no medical evacuation if you were wounded. You fought with whatever weapons you could carry, in whatever condition the sea crossing had left you, against people who were fresh, organized, and desperate. Hand-to-hand combat on a ship's deck was chaos. You couldn't see the whole battle. You couldn't tell friend from enemy in the smoke and confusion. You just swung your cutlass at anything that moved and hoped it wasn't one of your own crew. Even successful raids were disasters. Ships carried ballast, heavy stones or metal, that kept them stable in rough seas. Cargo might be in the bottom of the hold, under tons of ballast that had to be moved by hand. Some valuable cargo was actually worthless. Sugar that had been soaked with seawater, silk that had rotted in tropical heat, or spices that had been adulterated with sawdust by dishonest merchants. The most valuable cargo was often the hardest to steal. Gold and silver were hidden in secret compartments. Important documents were kept in locked, strong boxes. Passengers' personal valuables were sewn into clothing or hidden in body cavities. You might capture a ship worth thousands of pounds only to find a few dozen coins and some rotting food. Time was never on your side. Other ships in the convoy would escape and report your position. Naval patrols would respond to distress signals. Every minute you spent searching a captured ship was another minute closer to finding yourself outnumbered and outgunned. Many pirate crews were caught and killed while they were still trying to figure out what they'd stolen. And then there was the problem of what to do with prisoners. Killing everyone was murder, which carried the death penalty. But letting witnesses go meant they could identify your ship, your crew, and your hunting grounds. Some pirates solved this by sinking captured ships with everyone aboard, but that eliminated any chance of ransom money, and guaranteed that naval forces would hunt you with particular enthusiasm. Weather could turn any raid into a catastrophe. Sudden storms could separate your ship from its target, drive both vessels onto reefs, or create seas so rough that boarding became impossible. Many pirates died not from enemy action, but from being swept overboard during raids in rough weather. Their bodies were never recovered, their deaths never recorded, their shares of any treasure distributed among the survivors. The psychological pressure was overwhelming. You had to work as a team with men you didn't trust, on a ship that might sink, attacking people who were trying to kill you, for treasure that might not exist. Fear made some pirates freeze at crucial moments. Others became reckless and got themselves and their shipmates killed. Still others broke under the stress and had to be restrained or abandoned. Even when everything went perfectly, when you found a rich target, captured it without casualties, and loaded your ship with valuable cargo, you still had to escape, find a place to sell stolen goods, divide the treasure fairly, and avoid the naval forces that were now actively hunting you. Success in one raid just made you a bigger target for the next one. Every pirate story talks about treasure, but here's the truth. Most pirates died broke, and the few who got rich didn't stay that way long. The legendary hoards of gold and silver were marketing fiction created by people who'd never spent a day at sea. First, let's talk about what ships actually carried. Most merchant vessels transported bulk cargo: sugar, tobacco, cotton, lumber, or other goods that were valuable in large quantities but worthless to pirates. You couldn't eat cotton, you couldn't drink tobacco, and good luck finding someone willing to buy stolen sugar from a ship full of armed criminals. Spanish treasure galleons loaded with gold and silver were rare, heavily guarded, and usually traveled in fleets with naval escorts. The ones that sailed alone were often decoys carrying minimal cargo, while the real treasure traveled by different routes. Even when pirates successfully captured a treasure ship, the cargo was usually silver bars that weighed hundreds of pounds each. Try swimming to shore with 200 pounds of silver strapped to your back. Most treasure was actually other people's money. which created its own problems. Captured coins were often Spanish pieces of 8, Portuguese cruzados, or Dutch guilders that had to be exchanged for usable currency. Money changers charged huge fees for converting foreign coins, assuming you could find one willing to deal with obvious pirates. Many pirates ended up trading valuable silver coins for a fraction of their worth just to get money they could actually spend. Stolen goods were nearly impossible to sell legitimately. Merchants recognized valuable items that had been reported stolen, unique pieces, artwork, jewelry, or crafted objects could be traced back to their original owners. Pirates often had to sell treasures for pennies on the dollar to fencers who specialized in stolen goods and charged accordingly. The division of treasure was a constant source of conflict. Pirate articles specified how loot should be shared, but interpreting those rules during the heat of dividing actual treasure led to arguments, fights, and mutinies. The captain got the largest share, officers got more than ordinary crew, and someone always felt cheated. Many crews split up over treasure disputes. Each faction took part of the loot, and none of them got enough to matter. Even when pirates got their hands on significant treasure, they had nowhere safe to keep it. Banks didn't do business with known criminals. Hiding treasure on deserted islands was a good way to lose it to other pirates, colonial authorities, or simple geography. Islands shifted, landmarks changed, and maps drawn by drunk pirates weren't exactly reliable. Most pirates carried their wealth with them, making them walking targets for robbery. Shore leave was where treasure disappeared fastest. After months at sea, eating hardtack and drinking contaminated water, pirates hit port towns with pockets full of money and a desperate need to feel human again. They spent fortunes on decent food, clean clothes, comfortable beds, and companionship. A successful raid could be completely squandered in a week of tavern bills and gambling debts. Gambling was the fastest way to go from rich to broke. Pirates played cards, dice, and any other game they could bet on. Men who'd risked their lives for treasure would lose it all on a single hand of cards or a roll of dice. Some pirates won big and immediately lost bigger. Others developed gambling addictions that consumed every penny they earned.
Women in port towns were experts at separating pirates from their money. Prostitutes charged premium rates for their services. Tavern wenches sold watered-down rum at premium prices. And enterprising locals offered investment opportunities that mysteriously disappeared along with the investors' money. Pirates were easy targets. They had cash, they were far from home, and they weren't likely to file complaints with local authorities. Legal expenses consumed vast amounts of pirate treasure. Getting arrested meant paying for lawyers, bribes, and fines. Assuming you could avoid execution entirely, even pirates who never got caught spent money on false papers, safe passage, and protection from local officials. Corruption was expensive, but it was cheaper than hanging. The constant threat of capture meant pirates couldn't enjoy their wealth. They couldn't buy property under their real names. They couldn't invest in legitimate businesses. They couldn't leave money to their families. Their treasure had to be portable, liquid, and easily hidden, which made it easily lost, stolen, or confiscated. Many pirates realized too late that the treasure they'd risked everything to steal wasn't worth the cost. A successful career might net a few £100s, enough to live comfortably for a year or two, but not enough to retire, and that was if you survived long enough to enjoy it, which most pirates didn't. The famous buried treasure of pirate legend? Pure fiction. Pirates needed their money immediately for supplies, repairs, bribes, and survival. Burying treasure meant you might never see it again, and pirates, who were constantly being hunted, couldn't afford to leave their wealth unguarded. The only treasure most pirates buried was their own bones. Being a pirate in the 17th century meant that virtually every government, merchant company, naval force, and colonial authority in the world had placed a price on your head. You weren't just an outlaw, you were an enemy of civilization itself. The Spanish considered all pirates to be enemies of the crown. Regardless of nationality,
Spanish colonial governors offered bounties for pirate captures, dead or alive. Spanish naval forces had standing orders to sink pirate vessels on sight. Spanish merchant captains carried authorization to torture captured pirates for information about other crews and hideouts. Getting caught by the Spanish meant facing the Inquisition, which had creative ideas about extracting confessions from heretics and criminals. The English Navy treated piracy as treason against the crown. Naval captains earned prize money for capturing pirate ships and crews, creating a financial incentive to hunt you down. English naval vessels patrolled known pirate routes. They investigated suspicious ships, and they maintained intelligence networks in port towns. The Royal Navy's resources were vast, their ships were fast, and their crews were professional military sailors who knew how to fight. Colonial governors throughout the Caribbean and North America issued proclamations against pirates. They offered pardons to crew members who surrendered their captains, and they authorized local militia forces to attack pirate ships. Some governors were corrupt and could be bribed, but others were zealous about protecting colonial commerce and saw pirate hunting as a path to promotion and royal favor. Merchant companies like the Dutch East India Company and English trading syndicates maintained their own armed vessels specifically for hunting pirates. These weren't just cargo ships with a few cannons. They were purpose-built warships crewed by professional soldiers and captained by men with years of experience fighting pirates. Company ships often traveled in groups. They coordinated their routes, and they shared intelligence about pirate activities. Local populations in port towns were torn between fear and greed when pirates arrived. Pirates brought money and bought supplies, but they also brought violence, disease, and the attention of naval forces. Many port communities developed complex relationships with pirates. They tolerated them for economic reasons, while secretly cooperating with authorities to eliminate them. A tavern keeper might sell you rum while simultaneously sending word to the nearest naval base about your ship's location. Bounty hunters were an entire industry built around killing pirates. These were professional killers who specialized in tracking down wanted criminals. They knew pirate haunts. They cultivated informants in pirate crews, and they operated with legal authority to capture or kill pirates anywhere they found them. Bounty hunters often posed as merchants, fellow pirates, or potential crew members to get close to their targets. Other pirates were sometimes your deadliest enemies. Rival crews competed for the same targets. Territorial disputes led to open warfare, and successful pirates were often betrayed by their own men seeking reward money. Some pirates turned to pirate hunting as a more profitable career. They knew how pirates thought, where they hid, and how they operated. Former pirates made the most effective pirate hunt. Indigenous populations along coastlines had their own reasons for killing pirates. Pirates raided native settlements for slaves, supplies, and information. They brought diseases that devastated native communities. They disrupted traditional trade relationships and territorial boundaries. Many coastal tribes developed agreements with colonial authorities to attack pirates in exchange for weapons, trade goods, or protection from other threats. Escaped slaves and indentured servants who joined pirate crews faced particular dangers. Colonial authorities offered special rewards for their capture because they represented a threat to the entire labor system. Recaptured slaves faced torture, mutilation, or execution as examples to other slaves considering escape. The few pirates of African descent who achieved leadership positions became priority targets for colonial forces. Religious authorities condemned piracy as a sin against God and man. Catholic priests in Spanish colonies preached against pirates as enemies of the faith. Protestant ministers in English colonies called for divine judgment against pirates. Some pirates faced excommunication, which meant they couldn't receive Christian burial or salvation. Religious condemnation added moral weight to legal prosecution and made it easier for authorities to justify extreme measures against pirates. Even neutral nations that didn't actively hunt pirates often cooperated with anti-piracy efforts. Treaties between European powers included provisions for sharing intelligence about pirate activities, coordinating naval patrols, and extraditing captured pirates. Pirates couldn't count on finding sanctuary in foreign ports. They might be arrested by Dutch authorities and handed over to English executioners. The legal system was designed to ensure that captured pirates died publicly and painfully. Piracy trials were brief, evidence standards were low, and convictions were almost guaranteed. Sentences were carried out quickly to prevent rescue attempts. Executions were public spectacles designed to deter other potential pirates. Bodies were often left hanging in chains, as warnings to sailors considering piracy as a career option. Weather and geography also seemed to conspire against pirates. Hurricanes destroyed pirate fleets and drove survivors onto hostile shores. Reefs that weren't marked on any charts, wrecked ships and stranded crews in territory controlled by enemies. Disease outbreaks weakened pirate crews and made them easy targets for naval forces. Even the ocean itself was an enemy that could swallow you without leaving a trace. Popular culture portrays pirates as free spirits who rejected society's rules and lived life on their own terms. The reality was that pirates lived under some of the harshest, most restrictive conditions imaginable, with less freedom than the poorest peasant on land. Pirate ships operated under strict articles, written rules that governed every aspect of daily life. These weren't suggestions or guidelines. They were laws enforced by brutal punishment. Articles specified when you could eat, how you could dress, who you could fight, and how you could spend your money. Violating ship's articles could result in flogging, marooning, or death. Your freedom to be a pirate came with a complete loss of personal freedom. The captain's word was absolute law. Unlike legitimate ship captains who answered to ship owners, maritime authorities, or naval commands, pirate captains ruled through fear and violence. They could order your death for any reason or no reason at all. You had no legal recourse, no appeals process, and no protection from arbitrary punishment. The captain's mood determined whether you lived or died each day. You couldn't leave. Once you joined a pirate crew, desertion meant death if you were caught. Pirates who tried to abandon ship during port visits were hunted down and killed as examples to others. Even if you managed to escape, you were now a wanted criminal with no legitimate way to earn a living. Former pirates were blacklisted from legitimate shipping. They couldn't return to their families without bringing danger to them, and they faced execution if recognized by authorities. Your time wasn't your own. Pirates worked around the clock, sailing, maintaining the ship, standing watch, and preparing for raids. There were no weekends, no holidays, no sick days. If you were too ill to work, you didn't eat. If you were too injured to perform your duties, you were considered dead weight that consumed resources without contributing. Rest was a luxury that could be revoked at any moment if the ship needed to change course, flee from enemies, or respond to emergencies. Privacy was non-existent. You lived, worked, ate, and slept, surrounded by dozens of other men who watched your every move. Personal belongings were subject to search and seizure. Private conversations could be overheard and reported to officers. Your thoughts and opinions had to conform to the crew's expectations, or you'd be labeled a troublemaker. Individual expression was a threat to group survival and was discouraged through violence. You couldn't choose your companions. Pirate crews were thrown together by circumstance, not compatibility. You might find yourself living inches away from someone you despised, working closely with someone you didn't trust, or depending on someone who actively wanted you dead. Personality conflicts couldn't be resolved by leaving. They had to be endured, or settled through violence that might result in your death. Financial freedom was an illusion. Your share of any treasure was determined by ship's articles and the captain's interpretation of those rules. You couldn't negotiate for better terms, demand immediate payment, or save money for the future. Most pirates spent their earnings immediately because they had no way to invest or protect their wealth. You were always one unsuccessful raid away from being broke again. Geographic freedom was limited by necessity. Pirates had to avoid areas with strong naval presence. They couldn't stay in any port for extended periods, and they were restricted to routes where merchant shipping provided targets. The vast ocean that seemed to offer unlimited possibilities was actually a maze of threats, dead ends, and territories controlled by enemies. Your movement was dictated by wind patterns, supply needs, and the constant requirement to find victims. Legal freedom was completely absent. You had no rights, no protections, and no recourse to justice. Conflicts were resolved through violence or the captain's arbitrary decisions. You couldn't own property, make contracts, or engage in legitimate business. Your very existence was illegal, and every interaction with the outside world carried the risk of arrest, torture, and execution. Social freedom was replaced by rigid hierarchy. Officers received better food, more comfortable quarters, and larger shares of treasure. Ordinary crew members were expendable resources to be used up and replaced. New crew members were treated as potential spies or threats until they proved their loyalty through violence. Social mobility existed only through the deaths of those above you in the chain of command. Even the freedom to choose your battles was taken away. Pirates had to attack whatever targets presented themselves, regardless of the odds or the moral implications. You couldn't refuse to participate in raids based on personal principles. Conscientious objectors were killed as mutineers. Your survival depended on your willingness to commit acts of violence that would haunt you for whatever remained of your life. The freedom to plan for the future was meaningless when death could come at any moment. Pirates couldn't make long-term plans, build relationships, or work toward goals beyond immediate survival. Every decision was short-term because there might not be a long-term. The constant proximity of death made all other freedoms irrelevant. Women who joined pirate crews faced additional restrictions. They had to disguise themselves as men, suppress their identities, and live under constant threat of discovery. Female pirates had even less freedom than their male counterparts, because exposure meant not just death, but often rape and torture first. The few women who achieved positions of authority in pirate crews did so by being more ruthless and violent than the men around them. The famous democracy of pirate crews was mob rule, not representative government. Decisions were made by whoever could shout loudest, fight hardest, or intimidate most effectively. Minority opinions were suppressed through violence. Voting was often done at cutlass point. The majority didn't rule. The most dangerous priority ruled, and everyone else submitted or died. Your freedom to be a pirate came at the cost of your freedom to be human. You couldn't show weakness, express doubt, or demonstrate mercy without risking your life. Normal human emotions had to be suppressed or disguised. Compassion was a liability. Trust was potentially fatal. Love was a luxury that could be used against you by enemies or rivals. When pirates finally made it to shore, they discovered that even the most pirate-friendly ports were elaborate traps designed to separate them from their money as quickly and efficiently as possible. Port Royal in Jamaica was legendary as a pirate haven, but the legend was mostly marketing created by tavern owners and merchants who wanted pirate business. The reality was that Port Royal was crawling with informants, bounty hunters, and corrupt officials who viewed every arriving pirate as a potential payday. Local merchants charged pirates triple the normal prices for supplies. Knowing that pirates couldn't exactly shop around or file complaints with consumer protection agencies, the famous tolerance of places like Tortuga or Nassau came with conditions that made it barely tolerance at all. Local authorities looked the other way as long as pirates spent money freely, didn't cause too much trouble, and left before naval patrols arrived. But not causing trouble meant accepting price gouging, tolerating theft from local criminals, and avoiding conflicts with other pirates who might be paying bigger bribes to the same official. Taverns were designed to extract maximum money from pirates in minimum time. Rum was watered down and sold at premium prices. Food was barely edible, but expensive. Gambling games were rigged to ensure the house always won. Prostitutes charged rates that would bankrupt a merchant captain, and many of them were working with local thieves to rob clients while they slept.
Pirates who complained about poor service or obvious cheating were thrown out by bouncers who were often off-duty soldiers or militia members. Local merchants operated elaborate fraud schemes targeting pirates. They sold fake maps to non-existent treasures, forged letters of marque that would get pirates hanged if they tried to use them, and information about merchant ship movements that was either wrong or deliberately misleading. Pirates desperate for supplies often bought spoiled food, watered-down gunpowder, and defective weapons at inflated prices. Even legitimate services came with hidden costs. Shipyards that repaired pirate vessels often installed deliberate weaknesses that would cause ships to fail at crucial moments. Doctors who treated wounded pirates sometimes reported their patients' conditions to bounty hunters. Suppliers who sold provisions to pirate crews might include poisoned food or contaminated water as a public service to eliminate criminals. Local law enforcement operated on a flexible interpretation of justice that depended entirely on how much money was changing hands. Pirates who paid sufficient bribes could walk around armed and drunk without interference. Pirates who couldn't pay found themselves arrested for minor infractions and held until their crews ransomed them or left them behind. Some corrupt officials arrested pirates just to steal their money, then released them after confiscating their evidence. Social acceptance was always temporary and conditional. Local populations tolerated pirates when they brought money and trade, but turned against them the moment naval forces appeared on the horizon. Pirates who thought they'd found safe havens discovered that their friends were perfectly willing to sell them out to save their own necks. Loyalty could be bought, but it could also be outbid by someone with a bigger purse. Religious authorities in port towns preached against piracy while quietly accepting donations from pirates seeking absolution. Some priests sold forged pardons, blessed stolen treasure for a fee, or provided sanctuary to pirates who paid enough for the privilege. But religious protection was as unreliable as secular protection. It lasted only until someone offered the clergy a better deal. Communication networks in port towns meant that news of your arrival spread faster than you could spend your money. Informants reported to multiple masters, local authorities, naval commanders, rival pirates, and bounty hunters. Pirates often found themselves tracked by people who knew their movements, their crew composition, and their financial resources before they'd even finished unloading their cargo. The constant rotation of temporary residents made port towns dangerous places to let your guard down. Today's drinking companion might be tomorrow's betrayer. The merchant who sold you supplies might be a naval intelligence agent. The woman who shared your bed might be searching your belongings for information about your ship's location. Trust was a luxury that could get you killed in places where everyone had multiple allegiances and secret agendas. Medical care in port towns was often worse than the crude surgery available aboard ship. Port doctors were frequently quacks, drunks, or criminals themselves. They charged enormous fees for ineffective treatments, sold fake medicines, and sometimes deliberately worsened conditions to extract more money from desperate patients. Pirates who survived battles at sea sometimes died from infections acquired in port town hospitals. Legal services were equally corrupt. Lawyers who claimed to represent pirates often worked for the authorities, gathering information about pirate activities while pretending to provide legal advice. Bribes paid to court officials might disappear without result. Legal documents purchased from corrupt clerks might be forgeries that would make legal situations worse, rather than better. Even entertainment was designed to separate pirates from their money as quickly as possible. Gambling houses used marked cards, loaded dice, and distraction techniques perfected over years of separating fools from their money. Theatres and cockfights were opportunities for pickpockets to work the crowds. Music halls charged admission fees that would support a family for weeks, for performances that were often amateurish or deliberately shortened. The irony was that pirates needed these corrupt ports, despite knowing they were being cheated. There was nowhere else to buy supplies, repair ships, recruit crew members, or convert stolen goods into usable currency. Pirates had to accept being robbed by merchants, cheated by officials, and betrayed by informants because the alternative was trying to survive indefinitely at sea without any contact with civilization. And when naval patrols finally arrived to clean out the pirate nests, the same merchants, officials and residents who had profited from pirate money would eagerly point out where the criminals had gone, what ships they sailed, and who had been helping them. Port towns survived by playing all sides against the middle, and pirates were always expendable when the game required a sacrifice. If the violence, starvation and hazards of pirate life didn't kill you, the medical care certainly would. 17th century medicine aboard pirate ships combined ignorance, superstition and desperation into treatments that were often more dangerous than the diseases they claimed to cure. The ship's surgeon was usually whoever had once seen an amputation performed or claimed to have medical knowledge based on treating farm animals. Most pirate surgeons were failed doctors, drunken barber surgeons, or simply crew members who'd survived their own injuries and now considered themselves experts. Their medical training consisted of whatever they could remember from watching other people die and whatever folk remedies they'd heard in taverns. Medical supplies were whatever could be stolen, bought cheaply, or improvised from ship stores. Bandages were torn from sailcloth, clothing, or whatever fabric was available. Surgical instruments were kitchen knives, carpenter's tools, or weapons adapted for medical use. Antiseptics consisted of rum, vinegar, or salt water when they were used at all, which was rarely because most pirate surgeons didn't understand infection. Amputation was the default treatment for any serious injury to arms or legs, broken bones, infected wounds, frostbite, and gangrene all received the same prescription. Cut it off and hope the patient didn't die from blood loss or shock. Amputations were performed on deck, in full view of the crew, with no anesthesia except rum and sometimes a leather strap to bite down on. Patients were held down by other crew members while the surgeon sawed through bone with whatever tools were available. The survival rate for amputations was appallingly low. Many patients died from blood loss during the procedure. Others died from infections that developed afterward. Still others died from shock, organ failure, or complications from the crude surgical techniques. Pirates who survived amputations often faced phantom pain, recurring infections, and disability that made them less valuable to the crew and more likely to be abandoned. Bullet and blade wounds were treated by probing with dirty fingers or unsterilized instruments to locate foreign objects. Surgeons often did more damage than the original wound by tearing tissue, introducing infections, and causing internal bleeding. Many pirates died from surgical complications rather than their original injuries. The lucky ones passed out from pain and didn't wake up until the butchery was finished. Fever was treated with bloodletting, deliberately cutting veins to drain blood from the patient. The theory was that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, and removing blood would restore proper balance. In reality, bloodletting weakened already sick patients and often hastened their deaths. Pirates suffering from malaria, typhus, or other fevers were systematically drained of the blood they needed to fight their infection. Digestive problems were treated with purges, powerful laxatives that were supposed to clean out the patient's system. These purges often caused severe dehydration, electrolyte imbalances, and rectal bleeding. Pirates suffering from dysentery or food poisoning were given treatments that made their conditions worse. Some purges were so violent that they caused internal injuries and death. Pain relief consisted of rum, opium, when it was available, or simply knocking the patient unconscious. Pirates with chronic pain from old injuries, arthritis, or other conditions had to choose between being drunk all the time or suffering in silence. Opium addiction was common among pirates who had access to the drug, and addiction often led to poor judgment, violence, and death. Skin conditions were treated with mercury compounds that were more toxic than the diseases they were supposed to cure. Mercury poisoning caused tremors, madness, and death. But pirates continued using mercury-based treatments because they occasionally seemed to work. Syphilis was treated with mercury until the patient died from mercury poisoning or the disease itself.
whichever came first. Broken bones were set by whoever was available when the injury occurred. There were no x-rays, no understanding of proper bone alignment, and no way to determine if internal damage had occurred. Broken bones often healed incorrectly, leaving pirates with permanent disabilities, chronic pain, and reduced mobility. Skull fractures were treated by drilling holes in the patient's head to relieve pressure, a procedure that usually killed the patient. Herbal remedies were based on folklore, superstition, and wishful thinking. Pirates used whatever plants they could find in port towns or on islands, often without knowing what they were or how they might affect human health. Some herbal treatments were harmless but useless. Others were actively poisonous and killed patients faster than their original diseases. Dental care was non-existent. Toothaches were treated by pulling teeth with pliers, often taking parts of the jaw with them. Most pirates lost most of their teeth to scurvy, poor nutrition, and crude extractions. Dental infections were common and often led to blood poisoning and death. Pirates with dental problems faced the choice between agonizing pain and potentially fatal surgery. Mental illness was viewed as demonic possession, divine punishment, or simple weakness. Pirates suffering from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, depression, or other psychological conditions were beaten, restrained, or thrown overboard. There was no understanding of mental health, no treatment for psychological problems, and no sympathy for crew members who couldn't cope with the violence and stress of pirate life. Pregnancy was a death sentence for women pirates. There were no prenatal care, no understanding of safe childbirth practices, and no facilities for delivering babies aboard ship. Women who became pregnant either died in childbirth, died from complications afterward, or were forced to abandon their newborns. Some women attempted dangerous abortions using toxic herbs or crude instruments, often dying from hemorrhaging or infection. The irony was that pirates often had access to some of the best medical knowledge of their time when they captured ships carrying trained doctors or medical supplies, but they usually killed or abandoned the doctors and sold the medical supplies for rum money, preferring their familiar ignorance to unfamiliar expertise. When pirates finally died, which most of them did before age 30, their bodies were usually thrown overboard without ceremony. There were no medical examinations to determine cause of death, no records kept for future reference, and no lessons learned from their suffering. Each new crew had to learn the same painful lessons about human fragility and the limitations of 17th century medicine. The financial reality of piracy was far removed from the treasure-hunting adventure portrayed in popular fiction. Most pirates operated in a state of constant economic desperation, always one failed raid away from starvation, and always deeper in debt to forces beyond their control. Ship maintenance consumed enormous amounts of money and resources. Wooden ships in tropical waters were constantly attacked by shipworms, marine borers that could eat through a hull in months. Sails rotted in humid conditions and had to be replaced regularly. Ropes deteriorated from salt water and constant use. Iron fittings rusted and broke. A pirate ship required constant investment just to stay afloat, much less remain seaworthy enough for raids. The cost of keeping a crew fed, even poorly, was staggering. Hardtack, salt pork, and contaminated water were expensive when purchased in the quantities needed to sustain 50 to 100 men for months at sea. Fresh water had to be acquired regularly, either through purchase or raids on coastal settlements. Rum was a necessity for crew morale and water purification, but it was also expensive and had to be constantly replenished. Weapons and ammunition represented major capital investments that provided no return unless they were used successfully. Cannons cost more than most people earned in several years. Cannonballs, gunpowder, and small arms ammunition had to be purchased or stolen in large quantities. Swords, pistols, and other personal weapons required constant maintenance and eventual replacement. A single failed raid could expend ammunition worth more than the ship itself. Bribes and protection money consumed vast amounts of pirate income. Port officials had to be paid to allow pirate ships to dock and resupply, Local authorities demanded regular payments to avoid harassment. Naval officers sometimes accepted bribes to ignore pirate activities or provide advance warning of patrols. Even corrupt officials were expensive, and their protection was never guaranteed. Medical expenses, though primitive, were still costly. Surgeons demanded payment for their services, however ineffective. Medical supplies had to be purchased or stolen. Pirates who were injured or became ill still required food and water while contributing nothing to the crew's productivity. Serious injuries often meant paying for treatment in port towns where medical care was both more expensive and marginally more effective. The division of treasure was rarely as simple as portrayed in pirate articles. Officers took larger shares, but they also bore greater financial responsibilities. Captains had to pay for charts, navigation instruments, and intelligence about merchant ship movements. They were expected to provide better quarters, food, and equipment for themselves and their officers. The largest share of the smallest treasure was still poverty. Successful raids generated income that disappeared faster than morning fog. Captured cargo often had to be sold quickly to fences, who paid a fraction of its legitimate value. Perishable goods spoiled before they could be sold. Bulk commodities required transportation and storage that pirates couldn't provide. Many valuable cargoes were worthless to pirates because they lacked the infrastructure to profit from them. Seasonal fluctuations in merchant shipping meant that pirate income was unpredictable and irregular. Some months offered rich hunting grounds with multiple targets. Other months provided nothing but empty seas and mounting expenses. Pirates couldn't budget for regular income because there was no guarantee that income would exist. They had to survive on whatever they could steal during good periods, and hope those periods would last long enough to sustain them through lean times. Competition from other pirates reduced the profitability of successful hunting grounds. Popular pirate havens became overcrowded with crews competing for the same targets. Merchants adjusted their routes to avoid known pirate territories. Naval patrols increased in areas where pirate activity was heavy. Success bred competition, and competition reduced profits for everyone involved. Legal expenses were crushing when pirates were captured or needed to negotiate pardons. Lawyers charged enormous fees for defending pirates, often taking their payment in advance and providing minimal service. Bribes to judges and court officials could bankrupt entire crews. Even successful legal defenses left pirates poorer than before their legal troubles began. Insurance was non-existent for pirates. Ships that were damaged couldn't be repaired at insurance company expense. Crew members who were injured couldn't claim compensation for lost wages. Pirates who were killed left their shares to whoever was strong enough to claim them. There were no safety net, no financial protections, and no guarantees that investment in pirate ventures would provide any return. Equipment replacement was a constant drain on pirate resources. Weapons were lost overboard, damaged in fights, or confiscated by authorities. Navigation instruments were expensive and fragile. Clothing wore out quickly in harsh maritime conditions. Pirates often ended their careers poorer than when they started, having consumed their capital in the process of trying to earn a living through theft. Retirement planning was impossible because retirement was a concept that didn't apply to pirates. There were no pensions, no savings accounts, and no legitimate investments available to men whose careers were built on crime. Pirates who survived long enough to consider retirement faced the choice between continuing their criminal careers until death, or trying to disappear with whatever money they'd managed to save, if any. The economic reality was that most pirates would have been better off financially working as legitimate sailors, soldiers, or laborers. The average pirate earned less money and faced greater expenses than comparable workers in legal occupations. The promise of quick wealth through piracy was a fantasy that motivated desperate men to choose a career path that almost guaranteed poverty, suffering, and early death. The average lifespan of a 17th century pirate was brutally short, and retirement was a concept that applied to other professions. Most pirates died young, violently, and far from anything resembling the comfortable old age that their treasure hunting supposedly promised. Combat was the obvious killer. but not in the dramatic sword fights portrayed in movies. Most pirates died from infections that developed from minor wounds, blood loss from injuries that would be treatable today, or simply being knocked unconscious and drowning in a few inches of bilge water. Battle wounds that seemed survivable often festered in the unsanitary conditions aboard ship, leading to gangrene, blood poisoning, and death weeks after the initial injury. Disease was an even more reliable killer than violence. Scurvy, typhus, malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery moved through pirate crews like invisible assassins, sometimes killing more men than enemy action. Pirates had no resistance to tropical diseases, no understanding of disease prevention, and no effective treatments for most illnesses. A fever that would be minor inconvenience today could be a death sentence in the 17th century. Accidents aboard ship killed pirates with depressing regularity. Falling from rigging meant certain death. There were no safety lines, no protective equipment, and no medical care for traumatic injuries. Heavy objects shifting in rough seas crushed crew members. Cannon misfires killed gun crews. Ropes under tension could slice through human bodies like wire through cheese. The ship itself was a collection of ways to die accidentally. Drowning was common even among experienced sailors. Many pirates couldn't swim, and those who could found that swimming skills were useless in rough seas, or when weighed down by weapons and clothing. Pirates who fell overboard during storms were simply lost. There was no way to turn a ship around in heavy weather to search for someone who was probably already dead. Even in calm seas, rescue attempts were often unsuccessful. Execution was the official end for many pirates who were captured alive. Hanging was the standard method, usually performed in public as a deterrent to other potential pirates. But execution wasn't quick or clean. Many pirates died slowly from strangulation rather than broken necks. Some executions were deliberately botched to increase suffering. Bodies were often left hanging in chains as warnings to other sailors. Torture preceded execution for pirates who were captured with information that authorities wanted. Interrogation techniques included rack, thumbscrews, and water torture. Many pirates died during torture sessions before they could be formally executed. Others were permanently crippled by torture and died from their injuries weeks or months later. Torture was both an information-gathering technique and a form of public entertainment. Betrayal by crew members was a constant threat that could end a pirate's life without warning. Mutinies weren't necessarily about taking control of the ship. Sometimes they were about eliminating specific crew members who were seen as threats, rivals, or liabilities. Pirates slept with weapons because they knew their shipmates might kill them for their share of Teza, their position in the crew hierarchy, or simply because they'd made an enemy over a trivial dispute. Suicide was surprisingly common among pirates who couldn't cope with the violence, isolation, and hopelessness of their situation. Some pirates jumped overboard during storms rather than face slow death from disease or injury. Others took poison when facing capture and execution. Still others simply stopped eating and drinking, choosing passive suicide over continued suffering. Disappearance was the fate of many pirates whose bodies were never found, and whose deaths were never recorded. Ships were lost in storms without survivors. Pirates were abandoned on deserted islands and never seen again. Some simply walked away from their crews during port visits and vanished into colonial populations, presumably to die unknown and unrecorded deaths. Age-related decline happened faster for pirates than for people in other occupations. The combination of poor nutrition, constant stress, exposure to disease, and physical trauma aged pirates rapidly. Men in their 30s looked like they were in their 50s. Pirates who survived into their 40s were ancient by crew standards, and often couldn't perform the physical labor that pirate life demanded. Weather killed pirates through exposure, hypothermia, and heat stroke. Tropical storms could last for days, leaving crews soaked, exhausted, and vulnerable to disease. Caribbean heat, combined with poor nutrition and dehydration, to create conditions that killed healthy men. Pirates had no protection from the elements except whatever clothing they could steal or buy. Navigation errors led to ships being wrecked on uncharted reefs, running aground on hostile shores, or simply becoming lost at sea until supplies ran out. Pirate navigation was often based on unreliable charts, inaccurate instruments, and navigators whose qualifications were questionable. Getting lost at sea was a death sentence that could affect entire crews simultaneously. Violence from other pirates was as common as violence from authorities. Territorial disputes, competition for targets, and simple conflicts over resources led to battles between pirate crews. These fights were often more vicious than battles with naval forces, because pirates understood each other's tactics and had personal grudges to settle. Pirates killed more pirates than naval forces ever did. Starvation was the lingering death that claimed pirates when raids failed and supplies ran out. Pirate crews sometimes found themselves hundreds of miles from land with no food, no water, and no targets worth attacking. Starvation wasn't quick. It was a slow process of watching your body consume itself while your mind remained clear enough to understand what was happening. The few pirates who did survive long enough to consider retirement faced the problem that retirement wasn't really an option. They couldn't return to their families or home communities without bringing legal trouble with them. They couldn't find legitimate employment because their only job experience was in criminal activity. They couldn't live quietly because their past might catch up with them at any time. Most importantly, pirates who lived long enough to accumulate significant wealth rarely got to enjoy it. Money saved for retirement was stolen by crew members, confiscated by authorities, or lost when ships were captured or destroyed. The pirates who died rich were usually killed for their money. The pirates who died poor had at least died for something they'd actually achieved. The mathematical reality was brutal. For every pirate who survived long enough to retire wealthy, hundreds died young, poor, and far from home. The odds of surviving a pirate career were worse than the odds of surviving most diseases. Piracy wasn't a path to freedom and wealth. It was a short road to an unmarked grave somewhere in the Caribbean. After months or years of violence, disease, starvation, and terror, many pirates began to understand a truth that was too late to act upon. They had chosen the worst possible life in the worst possible time in human history. The freedom they thought they'd found was actually the most restrictive existence imaginable. They were trapped aboard ships with men they couldn't trust, engaged in work that required them to risk death daily, living in conditions that animals would reject. The ocean that had seemed like liberation became a prison without walls, bars, or any possibility of parole. The wealth they'd risked everything to obtain was always just out of reach. Every successful raid led to greater risks as authorities increased patrols and merchants improved their defenses. Every accumulation of treasure made pirates bigger targets for rivals, betrayers, and bounty hunters. The more successful a pirate became, the more likely he was to die violently and soon. The adventure they'd imagined was actually monotonous terror, punctuated by moments of extreme violence. Most pirate time was spent maintaining ships, searching for targets, and dealing with the mundane problems of keeping dozens of men alive in a hostile environment. The exciting parts, the raids, the battles, the dramatic escapes, were brief episodes in a mostly miserable existence. The community they'd found among fellow pirates was built on mutual exploitation and barely contained violence. Pirates worked together because they had to, not because they wanted to. Trust was a luxury that could get you killed. Friendship was a weakness that enemies could exploit. Love was a distraction that could be used against you. Pirates were alone together, surrounded by people but truly connected to no one. The rebellion against society they'd thought they were leading was actually a surrender to the worst aspects of human nature. Pirates weren't rejecting civilization. They were rejecting the possibility of becoming civilized. They'd chosen to live like animals, in a world where being human required constant cooperation, compromise, and self-control. The escape from authority they'd achieved was actually an escape into a world where authority was more arbitrary, more violent, and more absolute than anything they'd left behind. Pirate captains wielded power that no legitimate ruler would dare claim. Ships' articles created laws that were harsher and more punitive than any legal code. Pirates had escaped the king's justice only to submit to the captain's tyranny. The romantic image of pirates that would survive in popular culture was created by people who'd never spent a day at sea, never killed anyone, and never faced the choice between starvation and murder. The reality was that pirates were desperate men who'd made the worst possible choices and were living with the consequences of those choices every remaining day of their short, brutal lives. Most pirates, in their honest moments, knew they'd made a terrible mistake. They'd traded the possibility of a difficult but potentially rewarding life for the certainty of a brief and miserable one. They'd chosen immediate gratification over long-term planning, violence over cooperation, and isolation over community. They'd sacrificed their humanity for a few years of terrifying freedom that wasn't really freedom at all. The tragic irony was that many pirates had originally turned to piracy to escape conditions that seemed unbearable: poverty, oppression, hopelessness, or legal troubles that threatened their lives. But piracy didn't solve any of those problems. It just replaced them with worse problems that had no solutions. Pirates who joined crews to escape hanging often ended up hanging anyway, but only after years of suffering that made their original problems seem trivial. By the time most pirates understood what they'd done to themselves, it was too late to undo it. They couldn't return to their old lives, because those lives no longer existed. They couldn't start new lives, because their reputations preceded them wherever they went. They couldn't even die peaceful deaths, because peaceful death was a luxury reserved for people who hadn't spent their lives making enemies of everyone they met. The final truth about pirate life was that it was a trap, disguised as an opportunity. The men who entered it thinking they were choosing freedom and adventure were actually choosing slavery and horror. They'd been deceived by stories told by people who'd never lived the reality, and by the time they understood the deception, escape was impossible. The ocean that had promised infinite possibilities delivered only infinite ways to die miserably. The freedom that had seemed so attractive turned out to be the freedom to suffer without help, die without dignity, and be forgotten without regret. The adventure that had called to them was actually a journey to nowhere that ended wherever their bodies finally stopped moving. And in the end, when disease, or violence, or simple exhaustion finally claimed them, most pirates died, knowing that they'd wasted their lives pursuing an illusion. They'd had one life to live, one chance to matter, one opportunity to leave the world better than they'd found it. Instead, they'd chosen to become parasites who consumed without creating, destroyed without building, and died without contributing anything positive to human civilization. The golden age of piracy lasted barely a century, but it was long enough to demonstrate that paradise once lost cannot be regained through violence. The pirates who thought they were escaping the problems of the modern world had actually created a society that combined all of humanity's worst impulses with none of its redeeming virtues. They'd built hell on earth and called it freedom. That's why you couldn't survive a day as a pirate in the 17th century. Not because you weren't tough enough, brave enough, or desperate enough, but because pirate life was designed to consume human beings as efficiently as possible, leaving nothing behind but bones bleaching on tropical beaches and stories that bore no resemblance to the truth of what those men had actually experienced. The real treasure that pirates sought was always the life they'd abandoned to become pirates. But by the time they realized what they'd lost, the tide had already carried them too far from shore to ever find their way back to the world of the living. Let's continue with some story. Mary Red had been living as Mark Roberts for 3 years when the dysentery finally broke her spirit. Crouched over the ship's head in the pre-dawn darkness, blood mixed with the contents of her bowels as another wave of cramps doubled her over. The stench rising from the planks below made her gag, but there was nothing left in her stomach to bring up. The binding around her chest had loosened during the night, and she pressed her arms against her ribs to keep the cloth tight. Discovery meant death. but death was beginning to seem preferable to this existence. She had joined Captain Rackham's crew, thinking that piracy would offer her the freedom that life as a woman never could. Instead, she had traded one prison for another, smaller and more violent than anything she had known on land. Samuel Pike's voice cut through the morning air, calling her to see the captain about supply counts. Pike served as quartermaster and the closest thing to a doctor they had aboard the Revenge. Mary straightened slowly, her legs shaking from the effort. The dysentery had been ravaging the crew for 2 weeks now, ever since they had taken on water in Nassau. Half the men could barely stand, and those who could still work were running the ship with skeleton crews during watch. She had managed to hide the worst of her symptoms, but Pike's sharp eyes missed nothing. Mary pulled up her canvas trousers and tried to walk steadily toward the stern cabin. Each step sent fresh cramps through her abdomen, but she had learned to move through pain. Women learned that early, and pirates learned it immediately. Captain John Rackham looked up from his charts as she entered his cabin. The space was luxurious by pirate standards, meaning it had a proper bed instead of a hammock, and a table that wasn't covered in rat droppings. The walls were hung with stolen tapestries that had begun to mold in the Caribbean humidity, and the air smelled of rum, sweat, and the rotten meat they had been eating for the past week. Rackham was younger than most pirate captains, having gained his position through a combination of luck, violence, and the ability to make quick decisions under pressure. He was also more perceptive than Mary would have preferred. His accusation hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. 2 water casks were missing from her reported count, and either she couldn't count or someone had been helping themselves to their supplies. Mary knew that theft of supplies was punishable by marooning or death, depending on the captain's mood and the value of what had been stolen. She also knew that she hadn't stolen anything, which meant someone else had, and was letting her take the blame. The weight of false accusation settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Rackham's hand rested on the pistol at his belt as he studied her face. Mary felt the walls of the cabin closing in around her. The dysentery cramps were getting worse, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead, despite the morning chill. If Rackham decided she was lying, he would demand to search her belongings and her person. The search would reveal her secret, and revealing her secret would mean death. Within minutes, Mary found herself confined to the ship's hold, a wooden box filled with the smell of bilge water, rotting rope, and dead rats. Pike had escorted her down the ladder and followed her into the darkness, carrying a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the curved walls. Pike was one of the few crew members who had shown her anything resembling kindness during her time aboard ship. He was also smart enough to have figured out things that other crew members missed. As he set the lantern on a barrel and settled onto a coil of rope, Mary realized this conversation would determine whether she lived or died. Pike revealed that he knew the real thief was Tommy Fletcher, one of the newer crew members recruited in Port Royal during their last supply stop. Fletcher had friends among the crew, while Mary had none. Captain needed someone to blame, and she was convenient. But Pike had suspected Mary's true identity for months, noting how she never stripped down with the other men, disappeared during bathing times, and showed no beard growth after 3 years at sea. The revelation hit Mary like a physical blow. She stared at Pike's weathered face, trying to read his intentions. He was older than most of the crew, probably in his 40s, with scars that spoke of decades at sea. His eyes were intelligent and patient, and he could have turned her in months ago if he had wanted to. Mary's hand moved instinctively toward the knife at her belt, but Pike made no threatening moves. He simply watched her with the expression of a man who had seen everything the world had to offer, and was no longer surprised by any of it. The hold seemed to press closer with each breath as Mary realized her 3 years of careful deception were about to end. Pike explained that things were different now. The captain was looking for someone to blame, and blame had a way of spreading once it started. He wanted to know her real name and why she was there, and then he wanted to figure out how to keep her alive. Mary looked around the hold, taking in the curved walls that seemed to press closer with each breath. She had kept her secret for 3 years, through storms and battles, and the constant fear of discovery, but she was tired of being afraid, and she was sick enough that death was beginning to seem like a reasonable alternative to continued deception. The words came out in a rush. Her name was Mary Ridd, and she was there because she had thought being a pirate would be better than being a woman. Pike nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear, then asked how that was working out for her. About as well as he would expect, Mary replied with bitter humour. Pike suggested there might be another option, one that involved Anne Bonny. Mary had heard of Bonny, though she had never met her. Bonny was one of the few women who openly lived as a pirate, serving as Rackham's lover and partner. She was reportedly as violent and capable as any man on the crew, and she had somehow managed to maintain her identity as a woman while living the pirate life. The possibility that there might be another woman who understood her choices was almost too much for Mary to consider. She had spent 3 years believing she was the only woman crazy enough to choose piracy over conventional life. But Bonny wasn't on this voyage, and Mary might not live long enough to meet her. Pike explained that Fletcher's theft would come to light eventually, probably within the next day or two. When it did, the captain would need someone to punish to maintain his authority. He couldn't let theft go unpunished, especially with the crew already on edge from the sickness. Mary was the most convenient target. Pike reached into his coat and produced a small bottle filled with dark liquid. The mixture was laudanum and rum, enough to make someone very sick, but not enough to kill them outright. If Mary could convince Rackham that she was dying naturally from the dysentery, he might abandon her on some deserted island instead of hanging her as a thief. Mary stared at the bottle. The plan was insane, but it was also the only chance she had of surviving the next few days. There was a fine line between appearing to be dying and actually dying, and she wasn't sure Pike had calculated the dosage correctly. But what choice did she have? Mary lifted the bottle to her lips and drank the entire contents in 3 quick swallows. The laudanum burned her throat and made her stomach clench, but she managed to keep it down. Then she lay down on the coil of rope Pike had been sitting on and waited for the drug to take effect. The laudanum worked faster than she had expected. Within an hour, her vision was blurring and her limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. The dysentery cramps faded into a general sense of nausea and disorientation. She could hear voices above her head, but they seemed to be coming from very far away. Sometime during the night, Pike returned with Dr. Morrison, the crew member who served as their physician. Morrison was actually a former barber who had learned surgery by watching amputations, but he was the closest thing to medical expertise they had. After examining Mary's fever and weak pulse, Morrison pronounced that she could go either way but was probably dying. Mary drifted in and out of consciousness for the rest of the night. The laudanum created vivid dreams that mixed memories of her childhood with images of death and violence from her pirate years. She dreamed of her mother, who had died when Mary was 12, and of the first man she had killed during a raid off the coast of Cuba. When she woke, sunlight was filtering down through the deck planks above her head. Her mouth felt like it was full of cotton, and her body ached from lying on the hard rope coil, but she was alive, which meant Pike's dosage had been accurate. The sounds of a ship preparing for action filtered down from above. Voices called out orders, feet ran across the deck, and she could hear the distinctive sound of cannons being moved into position. Pike appeared at the top of the ladder with grim news. A Royal Navy frigate flying British colours had appeared on the horizon, and the captain had decided to run rather than fight. The captain thought Mary was dying anyway, and saw no point in moving her if they were going to be running from the Navy for the next few days. For the next 6 hours, Mary listened to the sounds of a ship being pushed to its limits. The crew was running full sail, trying to outpace a Navy frigate that was faster and better armed than their converted merchant vessel. As evening approached, the cannon fire stopped abruptly. The Revenge had made it to a cluster of small islands where the Navy ship couldn't follow without risking their hull in the shallow waters. They had escaped immediate capture, but they were now trapped in a maze of islands with limited supplies and a sick crew. Pike climbed down into the hold that night, carrying his lantern and a canvas bag. Inside were women's clothes, obviously stolen from some captured merchant vessel. There was a dress, a bodice, stockings, and even a pair of women's shoes. Pike had been saving them, having had a feeling they might come in handy someday. Pike explained the next part of his plan. That night, after the crew settled down, Mark Roberts would die very quietly and peacefully. Tomorrow morning, Pike would report the death to the captain, and they would have a burial at sea, but there would be no body in the sailcloth, because Mary would already be on one of the islands, dressed as a woman, waiting for Anne Bonny to arrive. It was an audacious plan, and Mary could see several ways it might go wrong. But it was also her only chance of escaping both the immediate threat of execution and the long-term impossibility of maintaining her disguise. Pike revealed that he had once had a daughter about Mary's age who had died of fever back in Bristol. Sometimes he thought about what kind of life she might have had if she had lived, and maybe helping Mary was a way of helping her somehow. The next few hours passed slowly. Mary could hear the crew above her head, talking in low voices about their narrow escape and their prospects for reaching Jamaica safely. Someone was playing a fiddle, and the familiar tune made her think of taverns and port towns where she had spent brief periods of shore leave. She thought about her mother, who had died, never knowing that her daughter would grow up to become a pirate. She thought about the men she had killed in battle, and whether their deaths had been worth the freedom she had gained by taking their lives. Most of all, she thought about the future, and the possibility of meeting another woman who had chosen the pirate life. Pike returned just after midnight, moving quietly down the ladder with the canvas bag and a small boat compass. The process of changing clothes was awkward in the cramped space of the hold, and Mary had to move carefully to avoid making noise. The women's clothes felt strange after years of wearing canvas trousers and loose shirts. The dress was too tight in some places and too loose in others, and the bodice pushed her breasts up in a way that made her feel exposed. But for the first time in years, she looked like what she actually was. Pike led her up the ladder to the deck, moving slowly and quietly to avoid attracting attention from the watch. The night was clear, with enough starlight to make out the shapes of the islands around them. Mary could see a narrow beach about 200 yards away, backed by what looked like coconut palms. Pike lowered a small boat over the side, using ropes to muffle the sound of it hitting the water. Then he helped Mary climb down into it, passing her the compass and a small bag of supplies containing food and water for 3 days. Bonny should be there by then, if Pike's information was correct. Mary took the oars and began rowing toward the beach, grateful for the upper body strength she had developed during her years as a pirate. The boat moved quietly through the calm water, and within minutes she was pulling it up onto the sand. She turned back toward the ship and raised her hand in farewell. Pike was a dark shape against the stars, but she thought she could see him wave back. The island was small, probably no more than a mile across, with a freshwater spring near the center and several clearings that would provide good views of the surrounding ocean. Mary found a spot sheltered by rocks and settled down to wait, still wearing the unfamiliar dress, and trying to adjust to the idea that she was no longer Mark Roberts. For the first time in 3 years, Mary Red was free to be herself. Whether that freedom would last long enough to matter remained to be seen. As she waited in the tropical darkness, listening to the sound of waves on the beach and the rustle of palm fronds in the wind, Mary wondered if Anne Bonny would understand the choices that had brought another woman to this strange life. The next morning brought the distant sound of cannon fire, and Mary realized that the Revenge was under attack. She climbed to the highest point on the island and watched through the morning haze as her former ship engaged what appeared to be 2 Navy vessels. The battle was brief and one-sided, ending with the Revenge burning on the reef, where it had tried to make its last stand. Mary felt a strange mixture of grief and relief as she watched the smoke rise from the wreckage. Pike and the other crew members were almost certainly dead, but their deaths had also eliminated the possibility that anyone would come looking for Mark Roberts. As far as the world was concerned, he had died aboard the Revenge and been buried at sea. 2 days later, Anne Bonny arrived exactly as Pike had predicted. Bonny's ship appeared on the horizon just after dawn, flying the black flag that announced its piratical nature to anyone who cared to look. Mary watched from her hiding place as the ship anchored in the shallow water near the beach and launched a boat toward shore. Anne Bonny was everything the stories had claimed, and more. She was tall and strong, with red hair that caught the sunlight and green eyes that missed nothing. She moved with the confident stride of someone who had never doubted her right to take up space in the world. and she wore men's clothing with the casual ease of someone who had long since stopped caring about social conventions. Bonnie had come to the island following reports of the naval battle, hoping to salvage supplies or recruit survivors from the Revenge. Instead, she found Mary sitting by her small campfire, wearing a dress that had seen better days, and looking like a castaway from some merchant vessel. The conversation that followed changed both women's lives. Mary told her story honestly, explaining how she had disguised herself as a man to join Rackham's crew, and how Pike had helped her escape when her deception was discovered. Bonnie listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just absorbing the implications of meeting another woman who had chosen piracy over conventional life. Bonnie revealed that she had always known there must be other women like herself, women who found the constraints of feminine roles unbearable and were willing to risk everything for the chance at real freedom. She had been searching for such women for years, hoping to form a crew that could operate outside the masculine hierarchies that dominated most pirate ships. Mary found herself recruited into something she had never imagined, a pirate crew commanded by a woman and composed primarily of other women who had rejected the roles society had assigned them. It was not the freedom she had originally sought when she first disguised herself as Mark Roberts, but it was perhaps something better. Under Anne Bonny's command, Mary discovered what piracy could be when it was not constrained by masculine ideas about honor, violence, and leadership. Bonny's crew was no less effective than male pirate crews, but they operated according to different principles. They were more likely to spare prisoners, more willing to share treasure equally, and more capable of working together without the constant threat of violence that characterized most pirate ships. Mary's years of experience as Mark Roberts proved invaluable in her new role. She understood male pirate psychology from the inside, having lived among men for 3 years while hiding her true identity. This knowledge helped Bonny's crew anticipate and counter the tactics used by male pirates in naval forces. But Mary also discovered that being openly female in the pirate world brought its own challenges. Naval authorities were particularly eager to capture women pirates, viewing them as unnatural aberrations that threatened the social order. The rewards for information about Anne Bonny's crew were higher than those offered for male pirates of similar notoriety. Moreover, female pirates faced different kinds of violence and threats than their male counterparts. Capture often meant rape and torture before execution, and even fellow pirates sometimes viewed women as legitimate targets for sexual violence. Mary learned to sleep with weapons close at hand, and to trust no one outside Bonny's carefully selected crew. Despite these dangers, Mary found a satisfaction in her new life that she had never experienced as Mark Roberts. For the first time, she could be herself completely without the constant fear of discovery that had shadowed her previous existence. She could form genuine friendships with her crewmates, based on mutual respect rather than the wary camaraderie that characterized most pirate relationships. Mary's story became part of the growing legend of Anne Bonny's crew.